Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pints and Politics. My name is Drew. I'm here with Mike and Dr. Noel. Introduce yourself.
My name is Dr. Noel Colis, and I'm a semi-retired doctor that did colonoscopies in internal medicine.
Can I call you a butt doctor if you do
Uh,
colonoscopy?
that term has been
It
used.
has been used. Okay. Good to know. And Mike, where are we today?
We are in Little Falls at Perkins today. Just had a bite to eat, and I want to point out first of all, it looks like the Bethlehem Star is over our shoulder in the background. So I don't know, it's kind of a blessed look, maybe.
Maybe.
I think it looks good. It bodes well. But let me start off by saying, and we'll get a little bit of time so you can introduce yourself a little bit better, Doc. Um, the first time I heard Dr. Noel Collis talk was on the local radio station. KLTF does an amazing job, very conservative station, and they have open mic. And heard Doc being interviewed and talk there, and I thought I need to talk to this guy. Ended up getting hold of the radio program, got the number, and I've been amazed ever since. So it's a pleasure to have you on with us today, Doc. Um, I didn't know that you were that's what you worked as in the medical field. Um, Not that that changes anything, but a wealth of knowledge on so many levels, and it's just great to have you here. So if you could give us a little bit more of your background as far as politics and history and yourself, that'd be great.
Well, thanks, Mike. Well, Mike, I grew up in southern Minnesota, and I went to college at the St. Olaf College in Northfield. Went to medical school at the university. Then spent 5 years relieving my student loans by practicing in St. James, Minnesota. Then I went to South Dakota for an internal medicine residency and taught in the medical school there, and then came to central Minnesota here. And so appreciate the chance very much to be on. The way I got interested in politics is I used to work for a congressman named Tom Hagedorn, and his son Jim became my best friend. Of course, Jim got elected to Congress, and we were very close for years. But unfortunately, Jim died of cancer in February of 2022, which is a terrible loss for all of us. But I think it's fair to say what knowledge I do have of politics comes from Jim and his dad and watching the political scene.
Nice. Well, it should be fun. So you seem to have a list of topics you want to go through. Here, what do you got? What do you got first?
Well, Drew,
We're gonna
when
dive into it.
in talking to you and Mike today, I thought if we're going to talk about this, what's something that people are really interested in? And I thought what we really need to talk about is what makes America different? Why was there an American Revolution? And beyond that, if we look, why are we Republicans today? And I thought this is something we can explore, and hopefully our listeners will get some insights from us.
Oh yeah. What makes America different than any other country on the planet? Because there is an American exceptionalism there, because we are different. Historically, we're different. You look at our founding fathers, some of the smartest thinkers that the world has ever seen, and just a government that also kind of has not really been replicated. We've tried to replicate it and we can't. And so our culture is even different too.
Well, and I would say it's by far the most successful modern society.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Right.
The degree of wealth and innovation that we've seen
Exactly.
yeah.
In innovation, it's huge. What America has done in a short amount of time is phenomenal. And I lay that heavily on the freedoms that we've had that have been granted to us by our creator, certain inalienable rights. So if you want to delve into that a little bit more, Doc, and give us your thoughts, what makes America exceptional? Why are we here? Go ahead.
These are great points you guys make. Now, if we look through the ages, we look, what did government do? If we go back past ancient Rome and Greece and Babylonia, through the ages, what was responsible for killing people, enslaving people, destroying and taking away their rights? It was government. And what was the genius of our founders? They looked and they said, at that time, the established thought was what made government go was called the divine right of kings. That God gave the kings rights. These rights the king then gave to the people. In 1776, the founders said, we're going to give these rights to the people and not the king. That was a revolution in thinking. That is what we benefit from, and that is the basis of American freedom.
Yeah, honestly, you bring up the divine right of kings as a very interesting concept. This goes back all the way towards the beginning of societies, and your first government would be the strongest man would become chief, and king is just another word for it, like a tribal chief. And the most powerful guy who could essentially kill off all the challengers and have people just follow him would be the chief and the king. And so one of the ideas from this is the king has this divine right because he's stronger and more capable than the common folk.
I think the one thing that's you can tie this in with modern television. Actually,
Oh, really?
I believe. You ever watch this show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Oh, yeah. Where are you getting at? This is
So one of the options on that game show was ask the audience, right? So
okay.
when you polled the audience with a question, their success rate or how often they were correct was in the upper 90 percentile, if I remember correctly. And what does that mean? It means a large group of people will generally come up with the right answer. Generally. Not always, but generally. And I think when you apply that to government, and especially the way our government was set up, it's putting the power into the people to decide their leaders and the success of it. And I think what we've done though here is we've gotten away from that a little bit. Marketing has played an amazing
Yeah.
um
And the idea of trust the experts to build on that.
well, the trust the experts is a little bit different versus what I think what Doc was going at here with the people having the power.
Oh, yep.
So
Well, I was talking about, I guess, when we look at today, you look at the Democrats or the more authoritarian types, they say trust the experts. You have a guy like, we'll take Fauci, for example. He's the head of the CDC. He's been in medical for over 50 years. He should know what he's talking about. And so even if and in 2020, it seemed like he could say no wrong, according to like CNN and MSNBC. It's always like, you gotta do exactly what he says. Even though like double masking seemed a little
excessive.
redundant. And you're a doctor. How did does double masking work?
Masking it's very similar to putting a chain link fence around your yard to keep mosquitoes out.
Oh.
Makes absolutely no sense. Never did make sense. Lockdowns come not from science, lockdowns come from prisons in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah.
If we look at issue after issue, the vaccine was not a true vaccine. Say we think of measles or mumps as something that will prevent disease. The vaccine was a gene therapy that did not prevent COVID. Now, COVID disease and COVID infection were very different. They're very tricky in the way they talked about it because COVID disease was something that occurred after people were infected. But what you didn't hear them talk about was the so-called vaccine preventing infection because it did not prevent the infection in the first place, and they knew that.
Okay, so I know this is kind of a tangent, but how does gene therapy work in this regard, in this instance?
The gene therapy works, and it is, in a sense, a technical issue because it's based on something called messenger RNA, which is usually something that is a messenger that's sent by the cell to get the rest of this, by the nucleus, to get the rest of the cell to produce something that's needed. In this case, it commandeered the production mechanisms of this cell to produce an antibody to the spike protein, but that antibody, and this is technical, but that antibody did not prevent disease.
Right.
Huh. That's yeah. I just had to get a take on that.
Well,
I know it's a tangent,
great.
but
I think we could do a whole podcast on that.
yeah,
Really, because I've listened to your words on the radio about the quote unquote vaccine and the shot and so forth, and it's very informative. It's great to listen to. We started off with the premise
Yeah.
of our founding fathers and American exceptionalism. I would say we stumbled quite a bit when it came to COVID,
Yeah,
as
and
far as American
we've I'd
exceptionalism.
say going in the opposite direction, and I'd even tie that to the idea of bureaucracy and the trust the experts thing is a
Sure.
detriment. Because when you talk to like the how who wants to be a millionaire and the people, you have so much more access to knowledge. Like you can brainstorm and spitball, and you can find great ideas because you can challenge them, you can put them to the test. And steel sharpens steel when it comes to competition. So the best idea, when challenged, will win.
So let's go back to the original discussion point here, American exceptionalism and the history. And I believe one of the things that you wanted to talk about as well was the Second Amendment. Is that correct?
Well, that's exactly right, Mike. And when we talk about American exceptionalism, what was exceptional to start with is giving power to the people and not the king or a government. Because the American whole idea of government and exception is based on the fact that the government derives its just legitimacy from the people. This is why it was radical, and this is what we have to remember today.
And how does the Second Amendment tie into those freedoms and the voice of the people?
Well, Mike, there's of course a Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, the right to have arms, and we have to ask ourselves, could these governments throughout the millennia and ages have killed and made people slaves if those people were armed? If those people had self-defense, that could not have happened. This is one of the reasons it makes America exceptional.
I think I'm going to push back on that because people have had like the citizenry have had weapons, armaments for thousands upon thousands of years. If we look at the Greeks, every man would have to train with his weapons and become part of the army. The whole military was based on a militia, and the Greeks they would enslave themselves. Like the Greeks would enslave like the Corinthians, and the Spartans would enslave the Athenians.
I think the difference, though, is when you have an organized army
Mhm.
versus a armed populace. And I think there's a distinction there.
Okay.
Whereas our Second Amendment allowed the citizens to be armed, also trained, but um, basically a roadblock
I I I
for government.
Yeah, I mean, you're very correct where an armed people is harder to subjugate, but the thing is, when the government is the people, ultimately the subjugation, if they were to do it, they would do it to themselves and upon themselves.
And that's a critical distinction because in America, free people were armed. That is different than people in an army being granted the so-called right to have a weapon. What happened if those people in Greece used a weapon in the way the government did not approve? They would be killed or put in jail.
Yeah.
In our country, the Second Amendment gives people the right to defend themselves. That is why the left wants to take it away.
Yep.
Well, and I think a lot of times let's look at like the Middle Ages. You had various aspects of the military, the yeomen,
Yep.
were basically your peasantry, your people who were conscripted in a sort of way sometimes into the military to serve, but they were almost used as fodder,
Yep.
basically.
And then the knights would do all the
Right, your trained military was something a little bit different. But that Second Amendment it's one of, let me think. I wish I'd looked this up because across the world, the freedom that the Second Amendment gives us is distinct from, I believe there's only one other country that comes close to our Second Amendment, and I don't remember which one that
would it be
is.
Switzerland?
Nope, I don't remember. I thought it was actually a South American country, but I could be wrong.
But Switzerland is a good example because in World War II, what was the country in Europe the Nazis did not try to conquer? It's Switzerland because every citizen was armed.
Yeah, and the interesting fact about that is Switzerland's been neutral for 1,000 years, but they had really good soldiers in Switzerland. And actually, are you familiar with the Swiss Guard? So the Swiss would hire themselves out as mercenaries because they were fantastic. It's called the Landsknecht, German word or Germanic, and just so they were so good at fighting, and everyone was using them. They're like, well, we're not gonna destroy our place of mercenaries. So there was a European tradition not to invade Switzerland.
And I think the other thing we need to discuss is beyond Switzerland. If we look at our country with the Second Amendment, there are occasional tragedies. But what happens, the 20th century shows us what happens to societies in which private gun ownership is banned. There are genocides of millions of people.
Yeah, the whole society is a tragedy.
That,
Well,
Well, yeah,
Cambodia,
yep,
Soviet Russia.
Canada.
I don't believe there was a genocide in Canada.
I mean, it depends on who you talk to, but I'm not even getting on the idea of that. I guess I'm also, I want to add in the word democide, the slaughtering of the people. And in Canada, they in their euthanasia uh, policy. Are you familiar with that, Mike?
Theirs is more liberal than ours.
Well,
And-
it's moving towards doctor prescribed suicide,
Right.
if that makes sense. And if the doctor describes it, then the state can enforce it.
Well, I know, I think with the genocides that you're referring to, Doc, isn't there a list of 7 or 11 genocides that happened in the last 100, 150 years, something to that effect?
Oh, yeah.
yeah, if we look at the history of communism in Soviet Russia or in China, somewhere from 80 to 100 million citizens were killed by their own governments.
Yes.
Yep.
And if we look at Germany in the 1930s, Hitler himself said, we hate to use Hitler, but Hitler himself said, we're going to have a great society and wonderful society because we've disarmed the people from having their own firearms. Because having firearms prevents millions of deaths.
Yeah, and specifically with the Nazis, they did confiscate the guns before they rounded up the Jews.
And
Fun fact.
that's something we do not hear from the left today.
And really, that Second Amendment it's not for hunting issues, which often come up, or people say you don't need an assault weapon to hunt, but really it's a check on a tyrannical government. And I think that's one thing that our founding fathers were very wise on. They also understood human nature very well and how government not checked can go tyrannical very quickly. And this is one of those checks and balances that they put in place.
Well, you can use an assault weapon to hunt. So honestly, getting one, you have a dual purpose there. It's called efficiency. But no, yeah, no. Second Amendment: be armed, know how to use, like have a weapon, know how to use it, protect yourself is the idea, because you have a duty to protect yourself.
Well, and the other thing I think we have to look going beyond this is, as Mike said, we're an exceptional people because we're Americans and we have rights and we can defend ourselves. And if we look today, I think the three of us can describe ourselves as proud Republicans. Why are we proud Republicans? Because we look out today, the Democrat Party believes in Washington-based control of all American life. If one looks beyond almost everything they say, what they're saying, without necessarily bringing this fact out, they're saying Washington should control this. We should raise taxes. Washington should control our lives. We are Republicans because we believe that Washington is corrupt. It's full of corrupt politicians, and we should do everything possible to bring power back to the state and local levels and the people, and the very thing that made America exceptional to start with.
There's a saying that Mike has that wraps up your argument perfectly, in my opinion, is that the government closest to the people is the most effective.
Absolutely.
And the thing is, in DC, your politicians in DC don't know how you live out in the sticks or out in somewhere that's not DC or Los Angeles or Chicago or New York. And so they don't understand our problems, and that kind of makes it hard to understand how to fix it. For example, we have a wolf problem up here, and even St. Paul might be a little too detached to deal with this. Because we could solve our problem real quick if it wasn't for the boot of the Democrats sitting on us.
Well, and I think that's a good point. you're much more in tune with the issues of the population the closer you are to them. And anytime you get further disconnected, and I know right now in the state of Minnesota, there's actually a push to make the legislators, the House reps like myself, a full-time position. And I am very much opposed to that idea. Because how do I stay connected with the people in my area if I am not in my area the majority of the time?
Yeah, to know what's going on.
Exactly. So I'm opposed to this idea because it separates us from our constituents. And I think that's a really bad idea.
And this is another extension. The Democrats and the left want to empower politicians. We believe empowering people in what made this country great. And if we talk about local control, let's just take a look at healthcare.
Sure.
What's happened since we had Obamacare, and Washington is dictating and controlling what happens? People can't get care now unless an insurance company approves. It was not that way before, but it's that way now because Washington controls it.
I want to clarify something you said there, Doc. And I take issue with this because it was meant as a negative to call it Obamacare. But we really should be referring to it in the name that it was promoted as. And there's a reason for that. What was it originally called? What did Obama push it as? The Affordable Care Act. Is your health care affordable?
You know, it was before ACA or Obamacare existed, but now people pay through the nose for insurance that does them no good because the deductible's higher than their income for a year.
So government made a change, and we've talked about this many times on this show. Government tried to come up with a solution for a problem. We spent billions of dollars, and it really put the Democrats in bed with Big Pharma. Robert F. Kennedy talks about this very clearly, and how the Democrats have become the party of big business.
Yep.
We see this more and more. Look at the money that was being spent on races and where it comes from. It's coming from big money, and to solve that problem of affordable health care, because let's face it, the costs have risen and risen and risen. I shouldn't say we, they came up with a plan, the Affordable Care Act, which now, looking back on it, what are we, 12 years later, 14 years later,
Roughly.
something like that? And your health care is still one of the biggest costs. So your Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, did not solve the problem that it was meant to solve, and the people are suffering more now because of rising healthcare costs than they were before.
So can I say that the Affordable Care Act was neither affordable nor caring?
There you go. If you want to keep your doctor, you get to keep your doctor. That's what everybody was told, right?
Yeah.
And that has not happened. So I got a little rant there, and I apologize, but I think it really needs to be called that Affordable Care Act or Non-Affordable Care Act, because they promoted this. They said it was going to solve a problem, and it has not done it. Therefore, why are we still doing it?
So I got a question for both of you. Is healthcare a human right?
Oh, good question.
That is something each state should solve on its own.
Oh, well,
Because now we're giving the money to Washington bureaucracy that's corrupt and crooked. That power should be transferred to each state for them to decide for themselves.
but doctor, is healthcare a human right, though? Do you have a right to healthcare? Do you have a right for government-provided healthcare?
Well, see, the difficulty with that is healthcare is defined to different people in different ways. It didn't used to be that way, but it is now. So if we say healthcare, it means different things to different people. So to answer that question means breaking it down into its component. But one other thing, it's very important for us to talk, if we're talking about liberty and freedom and why we're Republicans, we were criticized for across-the-board income tax cuts because the left and the Democrats called this trickle down. What is the ACA or Obamacare? It lavishes billions and billions of your dollars on rich elitist corporations, and they hope some of that care trickles down to the people and the patients, and it's wrong because it's wasted in Washington corruption. We want to turn that back to the states and the people.
I think that's great. There's a comedian actually that comes out and says that politicians should wear, and seeing your shirt makes me think of this as well. He said that politicians should wear jackets or shirts like this with their donors on them, because then you know who owns them. And and really this is what it comes down to. Big pharma, big business they've gotten in bed with the Democrats. And it used to be that the Republicans were considered the party of big business. That is not the case anymore, and it hasn't been for quite some time. And those politicians, I'm going to use a different term, but those politicians who have sold themselves out to big business, they should. You should really understand where their money is coming from, how it's being spent, because your taxpayer dollars are being used against you. Sorry about the rant, but
Oh
I
no,
had to
you go
throw
ahead.
that
That's what we do here. We rant.
in.
Rant about things. And ranting is not a bad thing per se. And when we talk about, American exceptionalism and why we're Republicans, it's good that we have our ideas and it's good to know why you're right when you are right, correct?
Well, I think we need to be able to articulate our points, our arguments,
Hmm.
and help others understand. Because if we're not doing that, if we just base our stuff on emotions, which once again I believe that the other side does this very well, they play on emotions
Yeah.
because we're not educating the people. So when you're not educated, how are you going to make a decision? It's based on feelings generally.
Yeah. And that's how you end up with your big business because people, I've noticed they normally target the fear aspect. For example, with uh, with healthcare, because we're on the subject, with like you should get healthcare. In other words, like we should all pitch in for healthcare. Otherwise, people are going to die. You don't want people to die, do you? People are dying right now, and grandma can't afford her life insurance or whatever. So we need to subsidize that with tax dollars.
And you see, again, this is a problem we did not have when we had more local control. This really started when we had Washington-based control with the ACA.
And how much money does the centralized people get when they pass these big government bills?
Well, right now, we spend twice as much money on healthcare as the average of the rest of the developed countries in the world, and we have poorer outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we spend twice as much money and have poorer outcomes? Because we have Washington-based control instead of letting states and localities and people have control like we used to do. And we want to restore the greatness of this. We want to restore affordability to people. We want to turn this back from Washington.
So if I could sum this up, some of what you're saying here, when we look at what's happened, when we look at and I would say it's more the Dems than anything else, but the Republicans to a certain extent, every one of these programs, whether it's Affordable Care Act, War on Poverty, many of the things that have been put into place over the years to fix a problem has only grown the size of government, which, and I love when Paul Harvey says it in Freedoms to Change, he says, as the government gets bigger, the individual gets smaller. And as a Republican, we feel that the individual is important. And the collective is what the Democrats are saying they're trying to help. And unfortunately, when you try to do something just for the collective, or that's the mantra that's put forward, it ends up growing the size of government, which means more of your tax dollars are getting taken until you get to the point where you can't afford the simple things in life. So when you asked before about is healthcare a right, if you can't afford to put food on the table, um, I think we have bigger issues than healthcare at that point in time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned something about individualism,
Mhm.
and that's definitely part of why the Republican Party is huge on individualism, because America was founded on a sense of, and our culture even is hyper individualistic, whereas we don't see things as a collective, we see them from our point of view, and like what can I like. And JFK got this. That's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So it's the emphasis on what you can do in your life to make things better.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to add on that? Because I think that's all I got.
Well, the other thing that JFK said, and it shows how Democrats used to be a party of working people. Were not the party of elitists like they are now, because we want to do what actually the Democratic Party once did. John Kennedy said at that time, "We're America, and we believe that freedom comes not from the generosity of the state, but the hand of God." If that was said at a Democrat rally today, it was almost said verbatim that at a Harris meeting, she said, "You're at the wrong party." Because we stand for what John Kennedy stood for. These rights come from the generosity of God and not government.
I think that that's powerful words, and I think that's probably a good way to end this episode today. So if you could say that one more time and emphasize.
That was John Kennedy in his first inaugural address. Someone can look it up if they want. He said, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but the hand of God." That's what we believe today. That's why we're Republicans. That's why we stand for average people. And we're going to take on the elite and bring this government back to average people and restore the freedom that made America great.
I think that speaks volumes. It really does. So we're gonna wrap this up. We're over a half an hour already, but thank you very much for being on here today, Doc. It was great. And I know we have more issues, more things that we want to talk about. We might do that in another episode. But any other parting thoughts?
Parting thoughts. Well said. Look at the Declaration of Independence. Just adds to what you said. We are endowed with by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So
That's right. Well, it's great. Once again, we'll wrap this session up with
we got more coming
we're
with
in
regards to
Perkins,
this.
Perkins in Little Falls, Minnesota. Another great evening, and thank you very much for joining us this evening, Doc.
So thank you guys, and thank you to our listeners, and thank you to everybody that wants to restore the right of the people to govern themselves.
Oh, this is Pints and Politics. God bless.